Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, we're going to talk about the legality of modding software, specifically related to games. This spurned from the recent fiasco with Steam, where they tried to sell mods on their Steam workshop, and the whole thing was just a catastrophic mess. Modders got 25% of the sales, Bethesda got 45% of the sales, Steam got 30% of the sales, so modders got utterly shafted. Bethesda came out on top despite the fact that they weren't doing anything. Modders held all the legal liability according to the wording of everything. It was a mess. The whole thing was such a mess, it was never going to work. People were furious about it. They sent so many emails that apparently the bandwidth costs alone took up more money than Steam even made through any of the transactions. But anyway, though, I wanted to talk about some of the legal aspects of it, because some people have been talking about how it was such a legal mess. And there are a lot of reasons why it was a legal mess, and virtually everybody involved was kind of looking to get themselves sued, I think. It was just kind of crazy. But because we're going to talk about law, we've got the disclaimer. I am not a legal expert. I have no real background in law. I just read about stuff and kind of keep track of copyright law and things like that because I am involved in things where copyright law is of concern. But yes, the way to think about it is you could imagine, like if I were a commentator on the UFC, you know, and imagine that I had no actual prior experience in boxing or mixed martial arts or anything like that. I can comment all I want, but if ever I got in a real fight, I would get my ass kicked, theoretically. I actually do know a little bit of boxing. I mean, I'm real rusty. But anyway, the point is, the idea is that if you ever have any kind of real legal issues and you need to consult with a lawyer, I cannot be a legal counsel. What I say is just my speculatory nonsense. I don't actually know anything. There's all kinds of rules and regulations, and it's all just kind of wacky. The law is labyrinthian and not very intuitive. So anyway, so this is kind of my take on things based on what I've been reading and what I understand of copyright law, and based on my own intuition, but my own intuition may be wrong. But anyway, though, I figure I would start with kind of an intro to how the law even approaches the digital world, because it's actually kind of terrible. One of the biggest problems with this whole modding thing is that nobody actually knows whether or not it's legal. And in some cases, with certain types of games, it is almost certainly illegal. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act has been one of the biggest, it's had one of the largest impacts on the digital world. And unfortunately, it was pretty much put together by the music industry and not really by the software, anyone in software whatsoever. When they first put that law together, they were more or less trying to kill off Napster because Napster was allowing people to download stuff. And so they made up all these rules about what you could and could not do. You can't crack software, you can't crack DRM software. DRM was just becoming a thing. I mean, as people were learning how to like copy CDs and then send CDs to one another, they started trying to prevent that, and so they made it illegal for you to circumvent this sort of thing. This has led to all kinds of legal trouble because the DMCA law instated a whole bunch of rules that basically made it illegal to even study software. So for example, if you were a crypto analyst, which is like a person who studies software security, and you get a hold of a program and then you crack that program open for the benefit of studying it, you may be in violation of the law. And you could be arrested, and then you could be sued, and you know, depending on how severe your restriction was. They kind of go through cycles. I believe that they had like some clarification on it where they made it like you can crack it if you can crack software if you're like a professor, but there's like they have to agree to renew this rule every like so many years or something like that, and if they don't renew it, then it falls through and then you could be arrested again. So it's kind of a mess. And the reason why all of our digital laws are such a mess is because all the people passing the laws are like ancient dinosaur people from before we even had computers, and they have no idea how the computers work or anything. They're just kind of trying to pass these laws based on what other people are telling them to do. So for example, like I say, you get laws that are pretty much put together by the music industry, and the music industry is not really building software. They're not really focused on inventing anything. What they're doing is they're focused on protecting their own intellectual property. So they write all these laws about how we're going to handle digital sales and digital software and things like that, and they wind up being really clunky and completely non-suited to our increasingly digital world. I mean, the more that we improve, the more questions arise. This modding thing is one of those deals, though. Modding in Bethesda games actually is not I would presume is not illegal, because you can actually do so without cracking any sort of DRM. I mean, it's all there in the terms of service. They give you, they give you the stuff. They tell you you can do this. You can upload this thing. You can make these changes. They have software that they use, which allows you to do this. But what's interesting about Bethesda's software, and StarCraft 2 actually does this now too, is after Dota became a big thing, Dawn of the Ancients. Dawn of the Ancients was actually based on a custom map made in Warcraft 3. Some people got together and they just put together this little game in Warcraft 3. They'd scripted some stuff and they'd added a bunch of heroes and they played this game. And it got to be really huge. It became its own game genre. And so somebody came along and they made Dota 2. And they sold this on Valve, or Valve bought it actually, now Valve runs it. And so there was kind of like legal stuff, and Blizzard was kind of sore because the game was made on their map maker and they wanted to claim a piece of that. They wanted to have money come in from Dota and Dota 2 and maybe League of Legends or anything else they could possibly claim. I mean, really, they would love to take royalties for breathing air if they could find a way for to charge you to do that sort of thing. But they were sore about it. So when Blizzard released StarCraft 2, they put out a map editor, but it had all kinds of restrictive chaff about who owned what intellectual property rights when you use their software. Bethesda does this same thing. When you make a mod, their software has a terms of service that says, if you make a mod, we own the mod. And if you think you own the mod, then you can go jump in a lake. We don't care about you. We own your work. So this right off the bat is really interesting because in the past, we haven't really had tools or devices that function like this. Think about the absurdity of this kind of notion. If you think about, like, what if you went down to the hardware store and you bought a bunch of boards and you bought a bunch of nails and you bought a hammer and you went and you built a house? What if you got a call from the hardware store and they were like, hey, well, we licensed you to use the boards and and the hammer and the whatever. We own your house now, so we want you to pay us like rent on the house. Whatever the house is worth, pay us 30% of that. And every year, suddenly, you had to pay the hardware store 30% of what your house was worth. Imagine if that happened. Society would kind of collapse. We wouldn't be able to function like this. So these terms of service that they write into these things, these exist by themselves, even in kind of a legal gray area. Because the fact is, if a lot of companies started to make software tools, like imagine Adobe started to write in a clause that said, anytime you make something in Adobe software, we own whatever you made. Did you make art? Did you sell that art? We need a 35% cut, or Bethesda, we need a 45% cut. We need 45% of your sales, just a little under half of what you make. That goes back to Adobe. And so if you got a lot of companies that started to do this, eventually tools for making things would just become impossible to use. I mean, you couldn't work in an environment like that. So it's very possible that what these terms of service actually are is they're what you call unconscionable. They're basically one-sided clauses that are trying to seize your intellectual property rights. It's a totally bunk clause. If they tried to take you to court over it, I mean, maybe they would have an argument against you. But who's to say that would be able to stand up? Because as I say, if they could enforce that, then pretty quickly they would destroy society. So I don't know. I don't really think that that's a very enforceable clause, but they do throw that in there. This clause is their whole basis, was Bethesda's whole basis, I assume, for trying to claim ownership of all the mods that people are making and uploading to Nexus and the workshop and everywhere else. Like I say, I really would be surprised. I mean, like, this is the thing again, I come back to this, is our government, like I say, because they don't really understand the digital world, if you brought it to a court case and you tried to explain, one of the things that they like to do is they like to explain that software doesn't exist. You get into this sort of like, it's very metaphysical, like what is software, man? It's not really like a real thing, you can't really hold it. I mean, you can't snuggle it, you can't feed it to your children, man. There's no such thing as software, really. So what they're selling you are licenses to use the software. So if you buy software and there's a license, then you agree to the license and you are a licensee. They've been doing this consistently in a lot of court cases. One of the biggest court cases they had about this actually was called Vernor versus Autodesk. And what this was is there was this guy who was going out and he was buying Autodesk software, stuff like AutoCAD and things like that. And he bought them from garage sales, and then what he did is he resold them on eBay. And Autodesk software, if you're not familiar, is ludicrously expensive. It's like $4,000 for a copy of AutoCAD. And so if this guy was going around these garage sales, he'd buy this software for like 50 bucks, then sell it on eBay for like 200 bucks. He made that was a really good deal. And like people who wanted the software, they would buy it because, hey, $200 is way better than $4,000. So used sales, like having a used software market, anyway, he wasn't like copying things, he was just selling used software. And this idea of a used software market within Autodesk's, competitive sphere was really alarming because there was no way that they were going to be able to sell software for $4,000 if you could just buy it used for like $200 from a garage sale or something like that. If it was available on the internet for less, nobody would buy it for $4,000. So they sued Vernor. Like I said, there was no way that they were going to lower their prices. They're like one of the only companies that provides this, so they just sued Vernor. So they took him to court, and they argued that like there's no such thing as software, man. It's not a real thing. There's only a license for the software. You agree to use it, but you can't actually hold it in your hand. This thing doesn't exist if we didn't give you the license. So this is what they argued, was that you get a license to use software, and Vernor didn't actually ever have a license. He maybe bought the physical CD from a garage sale, but Autodesk never sold Vernor a license. And even had they sold him a license, it said in the terms of service that you couldn't transfer the license. I mean, they had all kinds of restrictions in it. I mean, Vernor owed us his firstborn child, and so on and so forth. There was all kinds of restrictions within the license that Vernor had to follow, even if he wanted a license. And so what was interesting was that the courts agreed with Autodesk, and they said, you know what, actually Vernor did only buy a license, he didn't buy the software. Nobody could resell the software because the terms of service said that there are no rights of first sale. And this was really fascinating because it established that a terms of service can actually trump various rights. Like, for example, the rights of first sale were kind of a big deal, and that was a major part of what it is. The rights of first sale are like if you buy a thing, then you have the right to modify that thing, and then you have the right to resell that thing. So if you buy like a used car from your neighbor, you have the right to replace the muffler and get it a new paint job and then sell it to somebody else. I mean, like if you think you can flip that car for more money after you spruce it up a bit, then you can do that. I believe assuming you go through all the proper legal channels that are laid out for car sales. But you could do that same thing, like if you wanted to buy like a desk, there's not any real regulations on that. But if you bought like an old desk and you painted it up and you sold it to someone else, that's legal. That's the right of first sale. You can also modify the desk. You could put great big goat horns on the desk and sell it to people if you thought there was a market for that. You could buy chess sets, and it doesn't matter who makes the chess set. You could sit down and you could paint little runic symbols on all the little chess things and then sell it to people who are big enthusiasts of that. I mean, you bought the chess set, you own it, you can modify it, and then you can resell it. So they argued this for the software. They said, well, I bought the software, like they bought the software, then they sold it to me, and then I sold it to someone else. This is all the right of first sale. Like he didn't even modify the software. He just bought the software and then sold it to someone else. So the courts ruled that because the terms of service, because the license declared that there were no rights of first sale, that there were no rights of first sale. And they established that a terms of service could actually trump your rights. So this is the thing that we get into that's really weird, is that right now where you look at Bethesda using the terms of service that says our tool seizes your copyrights automatically, there are laws on the book that show that this is the thing that they can actually do. But that Autodesk versus Vernor thing actually isn't totally set in stone. There have been a couple other notable court cases where it hasn't totally held up. I mean, some people will argue that there's a right of first sale. They found that like hacking tools, for example, do break several laws. But there's not really a lot of clarity right now how this stuff should work and exactly how powerful those terms of service should be. I know a lot of the average people think that the terms of service should not be anywhere near that powerful. If you realized how many rights you actually sign away when you agree to those things, I think people would be kind of furious. Like I say, just the very notion, like, it's really concerning just because I imagine like the day when you download Photoshop and Photoshop suddenly starts to demand royalties on your artwork. I mean, they would have no way to enforce it, but suppose they did. Suppose they put like a tracking program that exported with every file that you made, and if whenever you like sold something or whenever like they just kept track of where it was, something like that. And suppose there was something in the terms of service that said they could do that. That. Well, you agreed. You're a licensee. So yes. So the legality is incredibly confused and incredibly muddled. So I would have no idea who actually, just based on the terms of service, I would have no idea what to go with there. But when you get into actually like mod making and so on and so forth, and you look at like who owns the intellectual property, if you assume that those terms of service are bunk, and I would like to think that they're bunk, then comes the question of who would actually own the mods if they're being designed to go into a Bethesda game. And arguably, if you assume that terms of service is bunk, then there are probably a lot of mods that just belong to the people who make the mods. There might be some that are actually encroaching on Bethesda's intellectual property, but if you look at things like Sky UI, or any kind of mod that adds textures to the game, or mesh packs, or things like that, that adds like armor and stuff like that, these are all things made by people, and it generally, as long as it doesn't have like trademarks or symbols or copyrighted things, it's fine. Like, that would be stuff that you made. Like, if you sat down and you drew, like I said, runic patterns on the chess set, if you drew like runic patterns all over a shield, or like you made a portrait of your mother and you put it on like a painting that you're going to import into your own house, well, you own the copyright on that. You sat down, you painted that out, you made that texture. There's no reason why Bethesda should get like a 45% cut. If you were to sell that to someone, assuming that Bethesda's terms of service don't apply, there's absolutely no reason why Bethesda should get a cut of your earnings. I mean, it's just a picture. It doesn't have any of Bethesda's intellectual property in it, and they did give you the tool to import this stuff directly into your game. You know, so you could argue there's an argument where there's really no reason for some of these mods. There's no reason why Bethesda should get any kind of cut whatsoever, which is one of the things that I found really frustrating and just infuriating about the fact that they were taking a 45% cut. I talked about on Tumblr, I mentioned that if you work as a franchisee for McDonald's, then McDonald's will actually take about 12.5% of your sales. Now, there's also a $40,000 license fee, like you have to pay them $40,000. But to be fair, to open up a McDonald's, you also have to have like several $1 million in the bank or something like that. It's a lot of money to get started on a restaurant like that. It's not a tiny little investment. But point is, they only take 12.5% of your sales, and over the course of a decade, that $40,000 winds up being, you know, presumably not that much. If you're going to invest so much in a restaurant up front, you know, $40,000 isn't catastrophic. But they only take 12.5% of your sales. And if you look at what McDonald's does for its franchisees, they advertise their own brand, and they allow the franchisees to sell using the McDonald's brand. I mean, they're out there, they've got the McDonald's arches up, they license toys, like they go to Hasbro and they say, hey, we want to sell ponies in our Happy Meals, and Hasbro says, okay, you know, give us the money, and they give them the money. And then the franchisees get to sell My Little Pony toys, you know. There's a license negotiated for them. And McDonald's puts up ads on billboards, you know, they advertise on television. They do a lot of stuff. That they set up training programs, and you could argue about whether or not the training programs are any good, or whether or not the menus are any good, or this or that. These are all things to consider when you go into business with McDonald's. But the fact is that McDonald's provides you a ton of stuff for that 12.5. It's a partnership. I mean, McDonald's is doing something. There's a reason why you would want to sign on with McDonald's. It's not just like I'm selling hamburgers, therefore I have to pay 12.5% of my money to McDonald's. They do so much. They do a bunch of stuff for that cut of your income. But if you look at what Bethesda was doing, and whether or not there was a partnership there at all with the mod makers, there really was nothing. I mean, they provided the software to allow you to import mods into their game, but they already sold that. I mean, like, if you bought Skyrim, that software came with Skyrim. You were able to download it. That was what they had in there. You know, you bought Skyrim. Here's your construction set. There you go. So theoretically, you already bought the construction set. I mean, they made it. They released it. Whether or not you were going to sell the mods, you were going to get the construction set one way or the other. It's not really a continued sort of support thing. So these modders, I mean, they weren't really selling on the Bethesda brand. Like, for example, Sky UI. That wasn't named like Skyrim's Sky UI. Well, I guess you could say it was Sky UI, but I suppose they changed it to like Doug UI. Let's suppose the guy who made it was named Doug, and he sold this thing as Doug UI. So Doug UI is not in any way, you couldn't really argue that they're using the Skyrim brand to sell their user interface. It's just a user interface. I mean, it's kind of like if you buy a car, you paint flames on the car. Just because it's a Ford vehicle, that doesn't mean the flames are Ford flames, just because it goes on a Ford car. So just because you make a custom user interface and you import it into Skyrim, that doesn't suddenly mean that it's a Skyrim UI, even though you made it for Skyrim. I mean, like, you make particular mufflers for a particular, make or brand of car, but that doesn't make it like a Ford brand muffler or anything like that, or a Honda brand muffler. It doesn't, it's the brand, your brand is whatever your brand is. If you have a company and you're called Doug's brand company, then your mufflers are Doug's brand mufflers. It doesn't belong to the company that you made the mufflers for. So Doug UI would be a Doug brand user interface that Doug imports into Skyrim. And maybe Doug makes a collection of user interfaces. Maybe Doug could go along and he could make a user interface for Oblivion and Fallout and all these other things. And this Doug brand interface would become a really trusted interface brand. Whenever you wanted to download a new interface, you would go look up Doug interfaces. You wouldn't look up Bethesda brand interfaces. You don't look up, you might look up interfaces for Skyrim, but you're not going to look up like what's the Bethesda brand interface change, because Bethesda didn't make that interface. Bethesda doesn't market that interface. They don't put up billboards. They don't say, hey, go and get Doug brand interfaces. They don't advertise on the internet. They don't do anything for Doug. They don't do a thing. So that whole deal, like I said, that 45% cut, there was no partnership there. Bethesda didn't do anything for the modders. They were just taking the money. And what this is kind of an interesting thing. This is called rent seeking. This is a business practice. It can be compared to, for example, if you look at the Wikipedia description of it, it's somebody posted this on Skyrim, or not on 4chan actually, which is where I'm drawing. But anyway, rent seeking. Like, suppose that you're a landowner and your land, a river runs through your land. And it's a river that's used by a bunch of trading companies. They run boats up and down this river. And so one day you get this clever idea, and what you do is you go get a chain and you run it out across the river. And so whenever a boat comes by, you pull the chain up and you stop the boat. And the boat goes, hey man, what the heck are you doing? And you go, this is my section of the river. If you want to go through, you have to pay me money. It's called rent seeking. In a lot of cases, that sort of rent seeking is illegal because what it turns out that rent seeking like that does is it can harm an economy. It's kind of a broken window fallacy sort of thing, where if you go around and you break people's windows and then demand money for windows, then the money that they pay to have the windows fixed doesn't go to buying new shoes, it doesn't go to buying groceries, it doesn't go to any of these other things. It's just damage and then repairing the damage. It's harmful. It slows down the economy, it hurts local businesses, it does a lot of terrible things. So, this landlord, he stops all these boats and he takes a toll on all the boats and then doesn't really put it towards anything. He's not creating any value. He's just hurting the local economy. So a lot of times rent seeking becomes illegal because it's harmful. And what Bethesda really appeared to be doing with this whole thing was a sort of rent seeking, where they took all these things, these mods, and they were all free previously, and then suddenly they started trying to instate this system where where you pay for the mods and then they take a bunch of the money. They just skim a whole bunch off the top. Now, well, this is kind of evil. I mean, just by itself, this is really kind of evil. Even when you look at Steam, Steam wasn't innocent in this whole thing, but I guess what they usually take is a 30% cut. Like, whenever they sell games, they take a 35% cut, or a 30% cut of the sales. But Steam has to handle all the bandwidth costs, and bandwidth does cost money. There's stuff on Steam's end. So you could say there's a partnership with Steam. 30 is steep. Like I say, 30 is very steep. It's very common in the digital world. It's not like an ideal cut, but the internet has gotten very small, and so 30 is average for the internet. But Steam is a partner, though. I mean, they're doing something. They're providing a service. You're using the service. At least Steam is doing something for your money. Bethesda does nothing. They're just rent-seeking. They're taking rent, and they're just providing no extra value. And then the mod holders, of course, wound up with their measly 25%. Basically worthless. You could sell $1 million worth of mods and make $250,000, and that's great, but you have to consider that you paid $750,000 to middlemen, which is just obscene. Especially when $450,000 of that went to somebody who didn't do anything. They were just demanding that you pay a cut of your income. So Yes, but what's interesting though is that the rent seeking by itself is not illegal. I mean, as far as I know, there's not any specific laws about this kind of behavior, as terrible as it is. What might be illegal though is there is such a thing as vicarious copyright infringement. And this is kind of amusing. But you look at Bethesda, and they were by and large the greatest beneficiary of this entire thing. And I think this might be one of the reasons why they were all so quick to give up on it, was I think that maybe they started to realize as there was so much backlash, and they started looking at like modders had been using non-commercial licenses to program their things, and now that they were becoming commercial, the modders were getting calls or like emails from these groups that were like, hey, you have to pay a licensing fee. And you get into this and that. And the trouble here is that Bethesda, what they wanted to do is they wanted to lay all the responsibilities and all the liability on the modders. And like I say, there was no partnership here. Bethesda was not taking any liability. They weren't doing anything. This all laid on the modders. They were just saying, all right, you mod makers, you deal with all the legal stuff. If you get sued, you get sued. You agree that you are completely responsible. But there's such a thing as vicarious copyright violation. So with Bethesda taking the lion's share of the profits, it would be really easy to argue that the largest beneficiary of these copyright violations and these license violations would actually be Bethesda. They are basically the number one party in these violations, in fact. So while they say all the angry, I mean, like, people were shocked. They were like, I can't believe that we beat corporate America just by complaining. We probably didn't. The fact is that it was so likely to attract a lawsuit, and one that could actually reach Bethesda and probably Steam as well, that I think they probably just looked at it and they were like, you know what? Everybody hates it. It's not making that much money, and we're probably going to get sued. And so those two last ones were probably the two major contributors to why they pulled the whole thing. So Bethesda was probably at risk of a vicarious copyright infringement. You can't just take all the profits. I mean, like, if you could get away with that, what would stop people from setting up a scheme where, like, you have some dumb patsy who sells drugs on the street, and then you take like a 45% cut of whatever he makes on the basis that, you have friends who would beat him up if you don't take it. That would be like a protection racket, actually. I mean, racketeering is illegal anyway. But even if he did it just out of the goodness of his heart, or because he was dumb and you convinced him that it was the thing to do. And this is the worst part, is I think they were hoping that mod makers were gonna be like dumb teenagers, and they were just gonna rob everyone blind. But even if your friend was dumb and he just thought out of the goodness of his heart that he owed you 45%, if he got busted and the police found out that 45% of the drug money was going to you, you would still get arrested. I mean, like, clearly you're aware of the drug smuggling, like, you're taking money from the drug smuggling, you're benefiting from it, you are, like, vicariously, like, breaking the law. This is the thing. You can't cleverly circumvent the law just by having a patsy. It doesn't work like that. So Bethesda was violating the law via patsy, probably, and yeah, so they were gonna get sued. And then on top of all that, the Steam stuff was kind of weird, because then you get into the DMCA thing, where if Valve becomes aware of a copyright violation and they don't immediately act on it, then they become liable for that violation. So this was kind of that same deal where you had all these mod makers who got onto the thing, and then it became rapidly apparent that they hadn't paid their licenses, or they were using content that other people hadn't cleared them to use this content on. And so then you get into this thing where, like, Steam is selling products that are immediately going to get pulled off the market because the DMCA requires them to pull these things off the market, and so on and so forth. And so it was just going to be like the consumers were getting shafted left and right, or they were going to get shafted left and right. And Steam wasn't watching the whole thing. That was going to get them sued, most likely. It was just somebody at some point was going to look at this and say, like, okay, so all these mods you're selling aren't really following any rules whatsoever, and you're benefiting. You're a beneficial party, so you're a benefiting party. You can't just claim exemption from the law. So Steam as well was likely to get sued. So, bottom line. That plan was never going to work. There was never going to be a way that was going to go through. I mean, it wasn't just because everybody hated it. It was also just because it was dumb. I mean, it was exploitative. It was a little mean-spirited in some ways. I mean, like, my respect for Bethesda as a company has just dropped, like, I don't know. It's one of those things, like, I kind of don't even really like it's just sort of ugly. It's just gross, just unimpressive, so thoroughly unimpressive. Everything that happened related to that mod. I mean, they gave up on it, but it was just that little taste of like Valve crossed a line, and Bethesda was. I mean, like. I don't know. It's just like I said in the last video. It's one of those things where the internet's getting small. There's a lot of kind of monopolies over service, and they're not exactly monopolies, but there's sort of these. There's like one option that provides almost all of these services, and none of the other competitors can really compete in a way. They just can't get a handle on things because there's really no regulations, and there's the regulations that do exist are a mess, and they're made by like the music industry and have no like they weren't made with any consideration for what's actually going on in the world. It's all just very strange. So I don't know for sure whether or not modders can actually make their products legally. I like to believe they can. I would root for them, you know, because I think that what they do creates a positive impact on the industry. I think that Bethesda actually, Skyrim continues to be one of the best-selling games on Steam. I think in major part because you can go and you can download all these mods. I mean, like. There's a whole mod that creates Elsewhere, and so you can go to Elsewhere in this mod. You know, you can go and you can see other things. I think people are looking to add Cyrodiil into this whole thing. So the game continues to sell because the modding community continues to expand on the game. And stuff like I say, Cyrodiil and Elsewhere, those are copyrighted locations owned by Bethesda. But there was another guy, Trainwiz, who I've talked about before. Trainwiz made a setting called Deus. He made a mod called Deus Ex Machina, a steampunk-ish mod, and he created his own completely unique setting for you to go visit, like his own little city with his own lore and all this stuff. And that probably wasn't a copyright violation. So even stuff like that stuff would be arguably legal. And a good reason to buy the game, just, you know, a good reason to buy Morrowind, just to try out Trainwiz's mods. And so it's beneficial. I mean, like, Bethesda maybe didn't produce anything. Bethesda hasn't released a new DLC for their game in quite a while, in years. But the modders keep doing it, and so you keep buying Skyrim. And the game continues to be interesting to contemporary audiences, even though it should have fallen to the wayside years ago. It's beneficial for this game's sales. It's bolstering. It creates value for the game. It's very positive. It's not something that needs to be destroyed. It's not something that should be illegal. It's not something that any company should be able to apply negative leverage towards. I think that it's a good thing. It's a positive thing. It should be good. But presently, there's no laws saying whether or not it's illegal or whether or not it's legal or illegal. And I fear that because our government still doesn't really understand the digital world, and they do understand money, that if they ever did pass any kind of regulations, it would just be in favor of the companies that want the leverage. And it would be just a disaster. Whatever law they tried to pass would just be a disaster. And it would become like this rent-seeking thing would just be the norm. But hopefully, like I say, hopefully that doesn't happen. And hopefully we don't start seeing more terms of service that steal your rights or circumvent your legal rights, and then have and if we do see more of them, ideally they won't be upheld in court. But who knows? And anyway, that's my analysis of the situation. Like I say, if you ever find yourself in legal trouble because you did something like you made a mod, be aware that every situation is a little bit different. There's a lot of different possible ways that you could violate the law. So that's why I say I can't be legal counsel. I have no idea what I'm talking about in the end, and I have no idea what your unique situation is. You would have to speak to a lawyer. But yeah, hopefully it all pans out at some point in the future. But I suppose that'll be it for now. So I will catch you guys later.